What would you do if the person sworn to protect justice was the one who destroyed it? Imagine spending 30 years behind bars for a crime you didn't commit, while the man who knew the truth wore the robes of a judge, celebrated as a pillar of integrity. This isn't fiction. This is the devastating true story of Harold Blackwood, a Chicago judge who built his legacy on a foundation of lies, and Michael Torres, the innocent man whose life was stolen to feed one man's ambition and resentment. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most disturbing cases of judicial corruption in American history, a story of power, betrayal, and a 30-year cover-up that finally crumbled under the weight of truth. Stay with us until the end, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the justice system. Chicago, 1950. The South Side was a neighborhood where dreams went to die, where the winter wind cut through worn jackets and hope was a luxury most families couldn't afford. Harold Blackwood was born into this world, in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on 63rd Street, where the elevated train rattled the windows every 15 minutes and the smell of the nearby stockyards permeated everything. His mother, Dorothy Blackwood, worked double shifts as a nurse at Cook County Hospital, her hands perpetually swollen from hours of standing, her eyes carrying the weight of endless worry. His father, Robert, spent 12-hour days at the steel mill, his body growing more bent with each passing year, his dreams shrinking to the simple hope that his son might escape the factory floor. Harold was their only child, and they poured everything into him. Every extra dollar went into books, into tutoring, into creating opportunities in a neighborhood where opportunities were as rare as quiet nights. Dorothy would quiz him on vocabulary words while cooking dinner on their ancient stove. Robert would bring home newspapers from work, making Harold read and discuss current events at the kitchen table, even when the boy was too young to fully understand what he was reading. But Harold understood something else perfectly. He understood that he was different from the kids in the wealthy neighborhoods. He saw it when his scholarship to a prestigious prep school brought him face to face with boys who had trust funds and summer homes. They looked at him differently. They spoke to him differently. Even when they were polite, he could feel the invisible wall between them, the unspoken message that he didn't truly belong. This feeling followed him to Northwestern University, where he excelled in his law studies but was never quite invited to the right parties, never quite included in the informal networks where future partnerships were born. He watched students with half his intelligence and twice his family connections glide into prestigious positions, while he had to fight for every opportunity. Harold graduated top of his class in 1974, but the celebration was bittersweet. His father had died of a heart attack 6 months before graduation, his body finally giving out after decades of brutal labor. Dorothy attended the ceremony alone, her pride in her son mixed with the grief of her husband's absence. Harold made a promise at his father's grave that day. He would rise so high that no one would ever look down on him again. No one would ever make him feel less than ever again. He became a prosecutor in 1975, and he was relentless. Harold had a gift for reading juries, for crafting narratives that turned complex cases into simple stories of good versus evil. His conviction rate was exceptional. He worked cases that other prosecutors avoided, took on defendants with expensive lawyers and political connections, and he won. Each victory was a small revenge against the system that had made him feel inferior. By 1988, at the age of 38, Harold Blackwood was appointed to the Cook County Circuit Court as a criminal judge. The newspapers called it a triumph of merit over privilege. Legal scholars praised the appointment. Community leaders from the South Side held him up as proof that the system could work for everyone. Harold stood in his chambers, looking at the black robe hanging on the door, and felt something close to vindication. But vindication is a hungry thing. It's never satisfied. It always wants more. Harold's courtroom became known for its efficiency and his no-nonsense approach. He was tough on crime, particularly harsh on what he saw as entitled defendants who thought their money or connections could buy them leniency. Defense attorneys learned to avoid drawing Judge Blackwood if their clients came from wealth. He seemed to take particular pleasure in denying motions from lawyers who drove expensive cars and wore custom suits. At home, Harold maintained the image of success he'd worked so hard to build. In 1989, he married Catherine Morrison, a rising star prosecutor with impeccable credentials and family connections Harold had never had. Their wedding was covered in the society pages, something that would have been unthinkable for the boy from 63rd Street. They bought a townhouse in Lincoln Park, a neighborhood Harold had once only seen from bus windows. They had 2 children, Emma in 1990 and David in 1992, who attended private schools and took piano lessons. From the outside, Judge Harold Blackwood had everything, but inside, the resentment still burned. Every social gathering with Catherine's family reminded him of what he'd overcome, but also what he could never quite have: the ease, the confidence, the assumption of belonging that came with being born into the right circumstances. He smiled and played the part, but part of him was still that outsider looking in, still that scholarship kid being tolerated but never fully accepted. And then, in the summer of 1992, a case arrived on his docket that would give Harold Blackwood a chance to even the score in the most devastating way possible. June 15, 1992. The body of Jennifer Wellington was discovered in Lincoln Park, not far from the zoo where children had been playing just hours before. She was 23 years old, a recent graduate from the University of Chicago, beautiful and brilliant, with her whole life ahead of her. The daughter of Martin Wellington, one of Chicago's most prominent defense attorneys, a man whose client list read like a who's who of the city's elite. The murder was brutal. Jennifer had been strangled, her body left in a wooded area off the main path. The crime scene was a mess. It had rained heavily that night, washing away potential evidence. There were no witnesses who saw the actual attack. What they did have was circumstantial evidence, and a lot of public pressure to solve the case quickly. Enter Michael Torres, 19 years old, Hispanic, working as a landscaper for the Park District. He had been working in Lincoln Park that day. He had no criminal record, was known as a quiet, hard-working kid who sent most of his paycheck home to his mother. But he was there. He was seen in the area, and when the police questioned him, he was nervous. The kind of nervous that innocent people often are when confronted by authority, but that looks suspicious under pressure. The police found fibers on Jennifer's clothing that were consistent with the uniform Michael had been wearing. They found that Michael had briefly attended the same community college as Jennifer 2 years prior, though there was no evidence they'd ever spoken. It was thin, circumstantial, built on coincidence and proximity. But the media was screaming for justice. Martin Wellington was calling in every favor, putting pressure on everyone from the mayor to the police commissioner. The case landed on Harold Blackwood's docket in September 1992, and from the moment Harold saw the names on the file, something shifted inside him. Martin Wellington, the defense attorney who had humiliated more than one prosecutor in Harold's early career, the man who lived in a Gold Coast mansion, who summered in Lake Geneva, whose daughter had attended private schools and elite universities as if it were her birthright. Harold read through the file carefully, and he noticed something. There was a witness statement buried in the initial police reports, taken the night of the murder. A Northwestern student named Amanda Chen had been jogging through the park around the time of the murder. She'd reported seeing 2 young men arguing near the area where Jennifer's body was later found. She described one as tall, athletic, wearing what looked like expensive workout gear. The other she couldn't describe well. She'd been too far away, and it was getting dark. Amanda had mentioned that the athletic young man had looked familiar, like someone she'd seen around campus. The police had followed up, shown her photos, but then the investigation seemed to drop that thread. Harold found a note in the file from the lead detective, witness unable to provide positive ID, pursuing other leads. But Harold dug deeper. He made calls. He discovered something the official investigation had missed or chosen to ignore. That night, Thomas Fitzgerald Jr. had been in the park. Thomas, the son of Judge Richard Fitzgerald, one of Harold's colleagues on the bench. Thomas was 24, athletic, a graduate of Northwestern, and he had a sealed juvenile record for assault that Harold's position allowed him to access. Harold pieced together what likely happened. Thomas had known Jennifer from social circles. They dated briefly. She'd ended it. He couldn't handle rejection. That night in the park was no random encounter. The evidence that supposedly connected Michael Torres, the fibers, the proximity, could just as easily connect to Thomas, who had also been in the park that night, running his usual route. Harold sat in his chambers late one September evening. The file spread before him, and he made a choice. He called the lead detective, Leonard Marsh, a man who'd been on the force for 20 years and knew how the system worked. They had a conversation that neither of them ever documented. Harold made it clear that pursuing the Thomas Fitzgerald angle would be complicated, politically messy, and ultimately career-damaging for everyone involved. Young Mr. Fitzgerald's father was powerful. The evidence was circumstantial. Michael Torres was already in custody, already charged. The case could be won. Detective Marsh understood. The witness statement from Amanda Chen was buried deeper in the file. The lead focusing on Thomas Fitzgerald was never pursued. Harold personally ensured that certain evidence requests from the defense were denied on technical grounds. When Michael Torres' public defender asked for access to all witness statements from the night of the murder, Harold ruled that only statements directly related to the prosecution's case needed to be disclosed. Amanda Chen's statement didn't fit that category, in Harold's interpretation. The trial began in November 1992. Harold presided with an air of stern fairness, but his rulings consistently favored the prosecution. When the defense tried to introduce evidence of other possible suspects, Harold shut it down as speculative. When they challenged the fiber evidence as too circumstantial, Harold allowed extensive expert testimony from the state's witnesses while limiting the defense's ability to counter. Michael Torres sat in the defendant's chair, bewildered and terrified. His mother, Rosa Torres, attended every day of the trial, praying her rosary in the back row, unable to understand how her son, her good, gentle son who'd never hurt anyone, was being portrayed as a monster. Michael's father, Eduardo, had to keep working to pay bills, but the stress was destroying him. Michael's younger siblings, Maria and Carlos, had their lives turned upside down, facing harassment at school, watching their family fall apart. The prosecution painted Michael as a troubled young man obsessed with a girl from a better background. They twisted his nervousness with police into consciousness of guilt. They made the circumstantial evidence sound ironclad, and Harold allowed it all, even encouraged it through his rulings. Martin Wellington watched from the gallery, his face a mask of grief and determination. He wanted justice for his daughter. He trusted the system. He trusted Judge Blackwood, who had a reputation for being tough but fair. He had no idea that the man in the black robe was orchestrating his daughter's killer's freedom while condemning an innocent young man. The verdict came on December 3, 1992. Guilty of first-degree murder. Rosa Torres collapsed in the courtroom. Michael stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Harold pronounced the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he spoke the words, Harold felt a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction at having outmaneuvered the elite legal system, shame at what he'd done, and a cold determination to never let the truth surface. Michael Torres was led away in chains. His life, effectively, was over at 19. And Harold Blackwood went home to his townhouse in Lincoln Park, where his wife had prepared a celebration dinner for a different victory, his recent appointment to a prestigious legal ethics committee. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the Chicago skyline, and he made a promise to himself. He would bury this so deep that it would never surface. He would be so exemplary in every other case, so respected, so untouchable, that no one would ever question his integrity. He would build a legacy so solid that this one dark secret would be crushed beneath its weight. And for 30 years, That's exactly what he did. Before we continue with what happened over those 3 decades, we want to pause and ask you something. What we've revealed so far is just the beginning of this devastating story. Knowing that an innocent 19-year-old was sent to prison for life while the real killer walked free, protected by a corrupt judge, how does that make you feel? Do you think you could ever trust the justice system the same way again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're reading every single one, and your perspective matters. Stateville Correctional Center, 1993. Michael Torres learned quickly that innocence meant nothing behind prison walls. The other inmates didn't care about his protests, about his claims that he'd been framed. Everyone in prison claimed to be innocent. Michael was just another number, another young man absorbed into the machine of incarceration. The first year was the hardest. Michael was placed in general population, where he had to learn to navigate a world of violence and survival. He was jumped twice in his first 6 months, once by gang members testing the new fish, once by an inmate who decided Michael's bunk was better than his own. Michael learned to fight back, learned to show no weakness, learned to become harder than the scared teenager who'd entered these walls. His mother visited every month, taking 3 buses to make the journey, bringing what little commissary money she could spare. Rosa aged a decade in those first few years, her hair turning gray, her face etching with lines of grief and helplessness. She never stopped believing in her son's innocence, never stopped praying, never stopped hoping for a miracle that didn't come. Eduardo Torres took the guilty verdict harder than anyone expected. He'd raised his son to believe in America, to believe that hard work and honesty would be rewarded, that the system was fair. Watching that system destroy Michael broke something fundamental in Eduardo. He started drinking heavily, lost his job at the warehouse, could barely look at his remaining children without seeing the son who'd been stolen from him. By 1998, Eduardo's liver was failing. He died in 2001, never having seen Michael outside of a prison visiting room since the trial. Maria and Carlos grew up in the shadow of their brother's conviction. Maria was 12 when Michael was sentenced. Carlos was just 8. They faced cruel taunts at school, whispers from neighbors, the stigma of being related to a convicted murderer. Maria threw herself into her studies, determined to become a lawyer and somehow, someday, find a way to prove her brother's innocence. Carlos went the other direction, falling in with a rough crowd, getting into trouble, eventually dropping out of school. The Torres family was collateral damage in Harold Blackwood's crime. Inside Stateville, Michael made a choice. He could let the injustice destroy him, or he could survive. He earned his GED, then started taking correspondence courses. He worked in the prison library where he had access to law books. He filed appeal after appeal, learning legal procedure through necessity, representing himself when he couldn't afford an attorney. Every appeal was denied. The conviction was solid, the evidence sufficient, the trial fair, at least on paper. Harold had been too careful, too skilled at hiding his manipulation. The years blurred together. 1995, 2000, 2005. Michael watched men come and go, some released, some transferred, some carried out in body bags. He watched as the prison population changed, as gangs evolved, as policies shifted. He became a fixture, a lifer, someone who'd grown old in a cage. The angry young man became a quiet, middle-aged one, his dreams of freedom fading into a dull acceptance of his reality. Meanwhile, Harold Blackwood's star continued to rise. He became one of the most respected judges in Illinois. He authored influential opinions on criminal procedure and sentencing reform. In 2001, he published a well-received book on judicial ethics titled The Burden of the Robe: Integrity in the Modern Courtroom. The irony was lost on everyone but Harold himself. His marriage to Catherine produced the picture of success: 2 accomplished children, a beautiful home that had expanded to a full mansion in Lincoln Park by 2005, summers in Martha's Vineyard, winters skiing in Aspen. Emma followed her parents into law, becoming a civil rights attorney. David went into medicine, specializing in trauma surgery. Harold attended their graduations, their weddings, and the births of his grandchildren, and he played the role of proud patriarch perfectly. But the secret was eating him alive from the inside out. It started with insomnia in the late 1990s. Harold would lie awake at night, his mind replaying the trial, seeing Michael Torres' bewildered face as the guilty verdict was read. He started drinking scotch before bed to help him sleep, then during the day to calm his nerves. By 2005, he was going through a bottle every few days, hiding it from Catherine, making excuses for his increasingly erratic behavior. The panic attack started in 2008. Harold would be sitting on the bench, presiding over a case, and suddenly his heart would race, his vision would narrow, and he'd feel like he was dying. He learned to hide them, to power through, to excuse himself for brief recesses when they became too severe. He saw a psychiatrist, who diagnosed him with anxiety and prescribed medication. Harold never told the psychiatrist the real cause of his distress. Catherine noticed the changes. Her husband, once confident and commanding, became withdrawn and irritable. He snapped at her over small things, disappeared into his study for hours, became distant from their children. She suggested marriage counseling. Harold refused. She suggested he see a therapist. Harold said his psychiatrist had it under control. The truth was that Harold was terrified that if he started talking about what was really wrong, he wouldn't be able to stop. In 2012, Harold had what his doctors called a minor stroke. Catherine found him collapsed in his study at 2 in the morning, a half-empty bottle of scotch on his desk, legal papers scattered everywhere. At the hospital, the doctors said he'd been lucky, minimal damage, full recovery expected. But they warned him about the drinking, about stress management, about taking better care of himself. Harold retired from the bench in 2015 at the age of 65, citing health concerns. His retirement was celebrated with a gala attended by hundreds of colleagues, lawyers, and politicians. They praised his 3 decades of service, his commitment to justice, his mentorship of young judges. Harold stood at the podium, accepting their accolades, and felt like the biggest fraud in the world. Retirement should have brought relief, but it made everything worse. Without the structure of work, without the distraction of cases and hearings, Harold had nothing but time to think about what he'd done. He started having vivid nightmares about Michael Torres, dreams where the young man confronted him, demanded to know why. Harold would wake up sweating, Catherine sleeping peacefully beside him, unaware of the demon haunting her husband. He thought about confessing 1,000 times. He'd pour himself a drink and imagine calling Catherine into his study, telling her everything. He'd draft letters to the Illinois Attorney General, laying out the truth, then burn them in the fireplace. He'd drive to Stateville, park outside, imagine walking in and demanding to see Michael Torres, but he never got out of the car. The fear of losing everything, his reputation, his family, his freedom, was always stronger than his guilt. By 2020, Harold was 70 years old, a shadow of the confident judge he'd once been. His relationship with Catherine was strained but functional. His children visited regularly but seemed to sense something was off with their father, something they couldn't quite name. Harold had 4 grandchildren who adored him, who called him Grandpa Harold and sat on his lap and made him smile genuine smiles for the first time in years. And in Stateville Correctional Center, Michael Torres turned 50 years old. He'd spent more than half his life behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. His mother still visited, now in her 70s, her hands shaking as she held the phone to talk to her son through the glass. Michael had stopped filing appeals years ago. There was no evidence to find, no new testimony to uncover. The man who held the key to his freedom had buried it too deep. Or so they both thought. Because in early 2021, a young journalist with a podcast and a passion for investigating cold cases was about to change everything. Thank you so much for staying with us this far. We know this story is heavy, difficult to hear, but it's so important. The worst and also the best is yet to come. Stay with us. Sarah Chen was 28 years old in 2021, an investigative journalist who'd made a name for herself covering wrongful conviction cases for a true crime podcast called Justice Delayed. She'd successfully helped exonerate 2 innocent people through her meticulous research, and refusal to accept official narratives at face value. Sarah was the daughter of immigrants, the granddaughter of Amanda Chen, the witness whose statement had been buried in the Torres case file all those years ago. Amanda had died in 2019, but before her death, she told Sarah something that haunted her. Back in 1992, when she was a Northwestern student, she'd witnessed something in Lincoln Park the night of the Jennifer Wellington murder. She'd reported it to the police, given a statement, and then never heard anything again. For years, Amanda had wondered if what she'd seen was important. She'd followed the trial, been shocked when Michael Torres was convicted, felt a nagging sense that something wasn't right but didn't know what to do about it. Sarah had been too young to remember the original case, but her grandmother's story stuck with her. In early 2021, she decided to investigate. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the case files, the trial transcripts, the police reports. What she received was extensive, but Sarah was thorough. She read every page, cross-referenced every date, mapped out every timeline. And she found her grandmother's witness statement, buried on page 247 of a 300-page police file. Amanda Chen had seen two young men arguing near the area where Jennifer's body was found around the time of the murder. One was athletic, wearing expensive workout clothes. Amanda had thought he looked familiar, like someone from campus. The police had taken her statement, but there was no follow-up, no photo array, no request for her to testify, nothing. Sarah started digging deeper. Who else had been in the park that night? She went through old student records, cross-referenced them with the timeline, and started finding names. She created a database, started making calls, tracked down people who'd been students at Northwestern in 1992. One name kept coming up in connection to Jennifer Wellington, Thomas Fitzgerald Jr. They dated. It had ended badly. Several people remembered that Thomas hadn't taken the breakup well. Sarah tried to find Thomas Fitzgerald Jr. and discovered he died in a car accident in January 2019. Dead end, or so it seemed. But Sarah was persistent. She tracked down Thomas's widow, Melissa Fitzgerald. The meeting was tense. Melissa was suspicious of a journalist asking about her dead husband. But Sarah was honest about what she was investigating, and something in Melissa's expression shifted. Melissa revealed that Thomas had struggled with alcoholism and depression in his final years. He'd been seeing a therapist, Dr. Robert Klein, for the last 5 years of his life. In one of his final sessions, just weeks before the car accident that killed him, Thomas had been particularly distressed. When he came home that night, he'd told Melissa something shocking. "I finally told him. I finally told someone what I did in 1992. Melissa had pressed for details, but Thomas had been drunk and agitated. He'd said something about a girl, about the park, about a mistake that had ruined lives. Melissa had assumed he was talking about some other indiscretion, maybe an affair or a business deal gone wrong. Thomas died 2 weeks later when his car went off the road during a storm. The investigation ruled it an accident, though there were whispers it might have been suicide. Sarah immediately sought out Dr. Robert Klein. The therapist was bound by doctor-patient confidentiality, but Sarah argued that with Thomas deceased and a potentially innocent man in prison, he had an ethical obligation to come forward. Dr. Klein wrestled with the decision for months. Finally, in November 2021, he made a choice. He contacted Sarah and told her that yes, Thomas Fitzgerald Jr. had confessed to killing Jennifer Wellington in their final session. He'd kept it secret for 29 years, eaten alive by guilt, but too afraid of the consequences to come forward. Dr. Klein had recorded the session, with Thomas's permission. As part of his treatment plan, he still had the recording. In it, Thomas described the night of June 15, 1992 in horrible detail. He'd seen Jennifer in the park. He'd approached her. She'd rejected him again, told him to leave her alone. He'd lost control, grabbed her, and when she screamed, he'd strangled her to keep her quiet. He panicked, left her body in the woods, and went home. When he learned that Michael Torres had been arrested, he said nothing. When his father, Judge Richard Fitzgerald, learned about the arrest and that his son had been in the park that night, they'd had a conversation that Thomas described as an understanding. Nothing explicit, but Judge Fitzgerald made sure the investigation never looked too closely at his son. Sarah had her smoking gun, but she needed more. She went back to the trial transcripts with fresh eyes. She noticed how many defense motions Judge Harold Blackwood had denied, how restricted the defense had been in pursuing alternative theories. She started researching Harold Blackwood's career and found something interesting. He'd been known for his particular harshness toward defendants from wealthy backgrounds. Was it possible he'd known about Thomas Fitzgerald and deliberately railroaded Michael Torres? Sarah dug into Harold's background and found a connection. Harold had been a prosecutor when Richard Fitzgerald was appointed to the bench. She tracked down retired attorneys who remembered that era. One of them, speaking on background, mentioned that Harold had always resented the old boys network, that he'd seemed to take pleasure in going after defendants with connections. Another mentioned that Harold and Richard Fitzgerald had served together on the bench for years, were cordial but not close. The pieces were coming together, but they were still circumstantial. Sarah needed proof that Harold had known about Thomas Fitzgerald's involvement and had suppressed it. She went back to the detective who'd handled the case, Leonard Marsh, now retired and living in Florida. At first, Marsh refused to talk, but Sarah was persistent, and eventually, over the course of several phone calls, Marsh's resolve weakened. In January 2022, Marsh agreed to meet with Sarah off the record. They met at a diner in Tampa, and Marsh, now 72 and suffering from emphysema, told Sarah something that made her blood run cold. Harold Blackwood had called him in September 1992, before the trial. They'd had a conversation about the case, about the various leads. Harold had made it clear that pursuing Thomas Fitzgerald would be politically complicated and career-damaging. Marsh had understood the message. He'd buried the lead, redirected the investigation, and helped secure Michael Torres' conviction. Marsh was dying. The emphysema was terminal, and he wanted to clear his conscience. He was willing to give a sworn statement, knowing it would likely end what was left of his life with disgrace, but feeling that at his age, with death approaching, the truth mattered more than his reputation. Sarah now had everything she needed. She contacted the Illinois Innocence Project with her findings. They were shocked by the evidence and immediately filed a motion for post-conviction relief. The story broke in March 2022. Sarah published her findings in a comprehensive investigative report, and within hours it was national news. The legal system moved faster than anyone expected. The confession tape, Marsh's sworn statement, the buried witness report from Amanda Chen, it was overwhelming. The state's attorney, not wanting to defend the indefensible, agreed to vacate Michael Torres' conviction. On April 15, 2022, almost exactly 30 years after Jennifer Wellington's murder, Michael Torres walked out of Stateville Correctional Center a free man. But Sarah wasn't done. She confronted Harold Blackwood at his Lincoln Park home on the morning the story broke. Harold answered the door in his bathrobe, looking older than his 72 years. When Sarah identified herself and told him she knew what he'd done, Harold's face went white. He tried to close the door, but Sarah pushed back, demanding answers. Why did he do it? How could he live with himself? Harold, shaking, told her to leave or he'd call the police. Sarah stood her ground. "You are the police," she said. "You were supposed to be justice, and you sent an innocent teenager to prison for 30 years to protect a killer. You need to tell me why." Harold looked at this young woman, so fierce and certain, and something broke inside him. He started to cry deep, wrenching sobs. "I wanted to hurt them," he finally said. "The Wellingtons, the Fitzgeralds, all of them. They looked at me like I was nothing my whole life. I wanted them to know I had power over them, and I used that boy to prove it." Sarah recorded the entire conversation on her phone. Harold Blackwood had just confessed to judicial corruption, to knowingly convicting an innocent man. Within hours, the Illinois Attorney General's office issued a warrant for Harold's arrest. The mighty had fallen, and Michael Torres, after 3 decades in hell, was finally free. April 15, 2022. Michael Torres stood outside Stateville Correctional Center, blinking in the sunlight he hadn't seen without bars and fences in 30 years. He was 49 years old, but he looked older. His hair was gray, his face lined, his body marked by decades of prison life. His mother, Rosa, now 75, embraced him and sobbed. His sister Maria was there, now a lawyer as she'd promised herself she'd become. His brother Carlos had died of a drug overdose in 2016, another casualty of the Torres family's destruction. The media circus was overwhelming. Cameras everywhere, reporters shouting questions, lawyers making statements. Michael stood silent, struggling to process that this was real, that he was actually free. The Innocence Project had arranged for counseling, for housing, for assistance in navigating a world that had changed dramatically since 1992. There was no internet when Michael went to prison, no smartphones, no social media. The world was alien to him. The state of Illinois moved quickly to offer compensation, $30 million, $1 million for each year of wrongful imprisonment. It was money Michael never wanted because the money couldn't give him back what was taken. His father was dead. His brother was dead. His mother was elderly and frail. He'd missed his 20s, his 30s, his 40s. He'd never dated, never married, never had children. He'd never had a career, never traveled, never experienced the simple freedom of walking down a street without permission. Michael gave his first press conference a week after his release. Standing beside his lawyers, he spoke slowly, carefully, clearly traumatized but determined to be heard. "I don't hate Harold Blackwood," he said, shocking everyone. "I pity him. He had everything: power, respect, a family, freedom. And he threw it all away because of his own bitterness. I lost 30 years, but I kept my soul. He lost his soul and will spend whatever years he has left knowing that." The statement went viral. Michael Torres, the man who had every right to be consumed by rage, was choosing compassion. It was extraordinary, and it made the contrast with Harold Blackwood even more stark. Harold was arrested at his home on April 16, 2022. Catherine filed for divorce that same day. She'd known nothing about her husband's crime, and she felt betrayed in the deepest possible way. The man she'd loved for 33 years, the father of her children, was a monster she'd never seen. Emma and David both released statements condemning their father and expressing support for Michael Torres. They both legally changed their last names, wanting no association with Harold Blackwood. The trial of Harold Blackwood began in September 2022 and lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was damning. The recording of Harold's confession to Sarah Chen, Leonard Marsh's testimony before he died in June of that year, the documentary evidence of buried reports and suppressed leads. Harold's attorneys tried to argue diminished capacity, that Harold had been suffering from mental health issues, but the prosecution demolished that defense. Harold had functioned perfectly well for 3 decades. He'd written books, given speeches, presided over hundreds of cases. He'd known exactly what he was doing. Harold took the stand in his own defense, against his lawyer's advice. It was a disaster. The prosecutor tore into him, asking him to explain how many nights he'd slept comfortably in his mansion while Michael Torres suffered in prison. How many family dinners he'd enjoyed while Michael ate prison food in a cafeteria full of violent criminals. How many times he'd kissed his wife goodnight while Michael lay alone in a cell, yearning for human connection. How many times he'd held his grandchildren, while Michael would never have children of his own, because Harold had stolen those years from him. Harold broke down on the stand. He admitted everything: the resentment, the deliberate manipulation of evidence, the 30-year cover-up. He begged for forgiveness, but his words rang hollow. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: obstruction of justice, judicial misconduct, perjury, and a special count of deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The sentencing hearing in November 2022 was standing room only. Michael Torres was there, sitting quietly in the front row. Martin Wellington was there, too, now 78 years old, devastated to learn that his daughter's real killer had been protected while an innocent man suffered. Thomas Fitzgerald Jr.'s widow Melissa was there, carrying the guilt of not coming forward sooner with what her husband had told her. The judge, a former colleague of Harold's who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, sentenced Harold Blackwood to 15 years in federal prison. At 72, it was likely a life sentence. Harold would die in the same kind of cage he'd sent Michael Torres to. Harold's final statement before being led away was brief. He turned to Michael Torres and said, "I'm sorry. I know those words mean nothing. I know they can't give you back what I took, but I need you to know that destroying you destroyed me too. I lived in a prison of my own making for 30 years, and now I'll die in a real one. I deserve every second of it." Michael Torres didn't respond. He simply watched as the man who had stolen his life was led away in handcuffs, the same handcuffs that had been placed on Michael 3 decades earlier. The aftermath rippled through the Chicago legal community like an earthquake. Judge Richard Fitzgerald, Thomas's father, was investigated for his role in the cover-up, but he had died in 2018, escaping earthly justice. Several other cases Harold had presided over were reviewed for potential misconduct, though nothing as egregious as the Torres case was ever found. The Illinois Supreme Court established new protocols for judicial oversight and mandatory review of cases involving suppressed evidence. Michael Torres struggled to adjust to freedom. The Innocence Project connected him with therapists who specialized in helping exonerees, but the trauma of 30 years of wrongful imprisonment doesn't heal quickly or easily. Michael suffered from severe PTSD, panic attacks in crowded spaces, difficulty trusting people, difficulty sleeping anywhere but a small, confined space because it was what he'd known for so long. He bought a small house in a quiet suburb, far from the city that had betrayed him. He spent his days gardening, reading, and slowly, painfully, learning to be a person again instead of a prisoner. He established a foundation with part of his settlement money, dedicated to helping other exonerees transition back to society and to funding investigations into potential wrongful convictions. Rosa Torres lived to see her son freed, but died peacefully in her sleep in December 2023, finally able to rest knowing her son's name had been cleared. Michael was with her when she passed, holding her hand, telling her that her faith in him had kept him alive all those years. Martin Wellington sought out Michael in early 2023. The meeting was awkward, painful. Wellington apologized for the role his family's influence had played in the rush to convict someone, anyone, for his daughter's murder. He admitted that he'd pushed for justice so hard that he'd inadvertently contributed to an injustice. Michael listened, and eventually, the two men shook hands. Wellington donated $5 million to Michael's foundation. It wouldn't bring Jennifer back, and it wouldn't give Michael back his lost years, but it was something. Harold Blackwood entered the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana, in January 2023. At 73, he was among the oldest inmates. He was placed in protective custody, as former judges don't fare well in general population. He spent 23 hours a day in a small cell, allowed 1 hour for recreation in a private yard. It was the same kind of isolation he'd condemned Michael Torres to, except Michael had endured it for 30 years while Harold faced a maximum of 15. Catherine Blackwood never visited. Emma and David never visited. The grandchildren were told their grandfather had died. In the eyes of his family, he had. Harold wrote letters that went unanswered. He tried to call on his allotted phone time, but no one accepted the charges. He was completely alone with the weight of what he'd done. In April 2024, exactly 2 years after Michael's release, Harold suffered a major stroke. He was transported to the prison medical facility, where doctors determined he'd likely never walk again and would require full-time care. His attorneys filed for compassionate release, but the motion was denied. Harold Blackwood would serve his full sentence, regardless of his health. Michael Torres, meanwhile, slowly began to build a life. In late 2023, he met Catherine Williams, a therapist who volunteered with his foundation. Catherine was a widow, 51 years old, patient and kind. They started talking, then having coffee, then dating. In May 2024, Michael smiled genuinely for the first time since his release when Catherine told him she loved him. They were married in a small ceremony in September 2024, with Maria serving as Michael's best woman and Rose's photo on the altar, a blessing from beyond. It wasn't the life Michael should have had. He should have married at 25, not 51. He should have had children who were now adults, not be starting over in his 50s. But it was a life, and it was his, and it was free. The case of Harold Blackwood and Michael Torres became a landmark in discussions of judicial ethics, wrongful convictions, and the need for transparency in the legal system. Law schools taught it as a cautionary tale. Reforms were implemented, but no amount of policy change could undo what had been done. In the end, there were no winners. Jennifer Wellington was still dead, murdered at 23 by a man who'd escaped justice for 30 years and then died without ever facing trial. Thomas Fitzgerald Jr. lived with his guilt until it likely drove him to suicide. Leonard Marsh died in disgrace. Harold Blackwood destroyed his family, his legacy, and his own life. Michael Torres was free, but 30 years of his life were gone forever, stolen by a judge's resentment and ambition. The only thing that changed was that the truth, finally, had emerged from the darkness where it had been buried. The lie that had been protected by the law for 3 decades had finally been exposed by the law. Justice had been served, even though it came 30 years too late. Michael Torres still visits Stateville sometimes, talking to current inmates, offering hope to those who maintain their innocence, funding legal reviews of questionable cases. He stands outside the gates of that prison and remembers the terrified 19-year-old boy who entered in chains, and he mourns for all the years that boy never got to live. And in a cell in Terre Haute, Harold Blackwood lies in a prison hospital bed, paralyzed and alone, finally understanding what it means to be trapped, to be helpless, to be at the mercy of a system that doesn't care about your protests of unfairness. He has years left to contemplate what he did, years to face the enormity of his crime, years to understand that some decisions can never be undone, some damage can never be repaired. The scales of justice eventually balanced, but the weight they carried destroyed everyone they touched. Conclusion. This is the true story of Harold Blackwood and Michael Torres, a story of how power corrupts, how resentment poisons, how one man's ambition can destroy countless lives. It's a story about the fragility of justice and the strength required to survive injustice. It's a story about how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way to light. Now we want to hear from you. After hearing this entire devastating story, do you believe Harold Blackwood's 15-year sentence was enough? Should there be even stricter oversight of judges and prosecutors to prevent this kind of corruption? How many other Michael Torreses are sitting in prisons right now, victims of a system that failed them? Share your thoughts, your anger, your perspective in the comments below. This conversation matters and your voice matters. If this story affected you, if it made you think about justice differently, if it reminded you that behind every case number is a human life, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the stories that need to be told, the truths that need to be exposed. And before you go, there's another story you need to hear. Click on the next video to discover the shocking case of District Attorney Rachel Morrison, who manipulated DNA evidence for over a decade, sending dozens of innocent people to prison while the real criminals walked free. The unraveling of her scheme reads like a thriller, but every word is true. Don't miss it. Click now. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for demanding better from our justice system. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, share this video to spread the truth, and follow the channel so you never miss an investigation. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and never stop questioning.